Before we begin, do me a favor, hit subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment if you notice the moment everything goes wrong, because once you see it, you won't unsee it. On a quiet night in May 1983, the emergency room doors in Springfield, Oregon burst open, and a woman rushed inside screaming for help. Her name was Diane Downs. She was young, attractive, and strangely composed for someone who had just lived through a nightmare. In the back seat of her car were her 3 children, each suffering from gunshot wounds. One of them, 7-year-old Cheryl, wouldn't survive the night. Diane told police she had been carjacked. According to her story, a stranger had flagged her down on a dark road, then suddenly pulled a gun and shot her children before firing at her and fleeing into the night. It was a horrifying, senseless act. Exactly the kind of story that grips a community and ignites fear. A random attacker. A monster still out there. Detectives arrived at the hospital expecting chaos, tears, and shock. What they found instead stopped them cold. Diane Downs was smiling. Not hysterical. Not shaking. Not numb in that hollow, dissociated way trauma often leaves behind. She was calm, talkative, and oddly cheerful. Nurses later said she laughed. One officer noted that she seemed more annoyed by the inconvenience than devastated by the injuries of her children. At first, detectives tried to explain it away. People react differently to trauma, they told themselves. Shock can look strange. But something felt wrong. As the night went on, Diane eagerly retold her story again and again. She described the attacker in vague terms. A man, average height, bushy hair, details that felt pulled from thin air. When asked about her children, she offered few specifics. Instead, she focused on herself. Her pain. Her fear. Her wound. And that wound raised the first real red flag. The gunshot injury to Diane's arm was superficial. The bullet had passed cleanly through soft tissue, missing bone, arteries, and nerves. Doctors noted that it was consistent with a self-inflicted wound, the kind that could be controlled and calculated. Meanwhile, her children had been shot at close range multiple times. Detectives didn't accuse her. Not yet. They listened. And they watched. During the interview, Diane leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs comfortably. She smiled at inappropriate moments, even flirting lightly with one of the officers. When told that her daughter Cheryl had died, her reaction was delayed and muted. No collapse, no scream, no visible grief. Instead, she asked if she could see a mirror. She wanted to check her appearance. That was the moment one detective later said he knew. Because grief doesn't look like that. As the investigation continued, the cracks widened. Diane's timeline didn't make sense. The road where the shooting supposedly occurred was heavily searched. No shell casings, no witnesses, no sign of a struggle. No one had seen a stranger matching her description. And despite an intense manhunt, the mysterious carjacker simply didn't exist. Meanwhile, Diane seemed almost energized by the attention. She gave interviews to the media, smiling on camera as she recounted the attack. Viewers across America felt uneasy watching her. Something about her tone, her posture, her eyes, it didn't match the horror of her story. Then detectives learned about Diane's personal life. She had been having an affair with a married man named Lou Llewellyn. Friends later told police that Diane was obsessed with him, convinced he was her future. There was just one problem. Lou didn't want children. And Diane had 3. Witnesses reported hearing Diane say more than once that her kids were in the way. That being a mother was holding her back from the life she wanted. At first, those statements sounded cruel but harmless, venting maybe. After the shooting, they sounded like motive. Detectives brought Diane back in for another interview. This time they pressed harder. They asked her to retell the events minute by minute. Each retelling came out slightly different. The position of the car changed. The sequence of shots shifted. Details appeared, then disappeared. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Diane didn't grow defensive or emotional. She smiled wider. She joked. She acted bored. Then came the question she wasn't ready for. A detective casually asked her to describe the moment her daughter was shot. For the first time, Diane hesitated. Her smile faltered. Her eyes darted away. The room went quiet. In that silence, detectives saw something flash across her face. Not sadness, not fear, but calculation. As if she were deciding which version of the story to use next. That pause said more than any confession ever could. Outside the interview room, officers compared notes. Every instinct they had told them the same thing. This wasn't a grieving mother. This was someone performing. And she was enjoying it. As days passed, the surviving children began to recover. One of them, 8-year-old Christy, would eventually tell investigators something that shattered the case wide open. But for now, detectives were stuck with a woman who smiled when she should have cried, who laughed when she should have broken down. A woman who wanted to be seen. And she was. By the end of that week, detectives weren't hunting a mysterious stranger anymore. They were building a case against the only person who had been there the entire time. The mother. And in that interview room, with her crossed legs and easy smile, Diane Downs seemed completely unaware that every grin was tightening the noose around her neck. Because sometimes the thing that gives you away isn't what you say. It's the moment you smile. When everything is already over. The first real crack in Diane Downs' story didn't come from a lab, a confession, or a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly from a hospital bed, wrapped in bandages and silence. Christy Downs was 8 years old when the bullets tore through her body. She had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the arm. Doctors weren't sure she would survive the night. 4 days she drifted in and out of consciousness, heavily sedated, her small body fighting to stay alive. Detectives waited. They didn't rush her. They knew that if she remembered anything, it would surface on its own. And when it did, it would change everything. Meanwhile, Diane remained free. She returned home. She gave interviews. She smiled for cameras and spoke about forgiveness, about faith, about moving forward. To the outside world, she was the picture of resilience. To investigators, she was a walking contradiction. Detectives began dismantling her story piece by piece. The alleged carjacking site was re-examined. Still nothing. No witnesses. No physical evidence. Traffic records showed that cars passed through that stretch of road regularly. No one had seen a man waving a gun. No one had heard gunshots. Then came the ballistics report. The bullets removed from the children were all fired from the same .22 caliber handgun. The trajectory showed the shots were fired from inside the vehicle, not from outside. The angles didn't match an attacker standing at the roadside. They matched someone seated in the driver's seat, turning calmly from target to target. When detectives confronted Diane with this information, she didn't panic. She laughed lightly and shrugged it off, suggesting the children must be mistaken or the experts wrong. Her confidence was unnerving. She seemed to believe that if she acted unbothered, the facts would bend to her will. They didn't. Behind the scenes, detectives dug into Diane's past. What they found painted a picture far darker than the smiling mother on television. Friends and co-workers described her as emotionally detached. She had a history of lying, small lies, unnecessary lies, lies told for no apparent reason. Former acquaintances recalled her fascination with attention, with being admired, with being desired. Several remembered her speaking bitterly about her children, referring to them as burdens. Then there was Lou Lewelling. Lou was married. He had made it clear he did not want children. According to multiple witnesses, Diane believed that if her children were no longer in the picture, Lou would choose her. She spoke about starting over. About being free. Detectives didn't need to prove motive beyond a reasonable doubt yet. They just needed to understand her mind. And what they were seeing was a woman who viewed her children not as people but as obstacles. While investigators built their case, Christy slowly regained strength. One afternoon, when a nurse gently asked if she remembered the shooting, Christy nodded. Her voice was quiet. But her words were devastating. She said her mother had pulled the car over. She said her mother had taken out a gun. She said her mother shot Cheryl first. Then Danny. Then her. There was no stranger. No carjacker. No mystery. Just a mother, a gun, and a choice. Detectives listened without interruption. They didn't ask leading questions. They didn't push. Christy repeated the same story multiple times, consistently, without embellishment. Her account matched the physical evidence perfectly. When Diane was arrested, she looked stunned, not fearful, not remorseful, but offended. As if the world had broken an unspoken agreement to admire her. During her arrest, she asked how the media would portray her. She asked if she could fix her hair. At trial, the prosecution laid out the evidence carefully, methodically. They showed the jury the timeline discrepancies. The ballistics. The medical reports. They played interview footage where Diane smiled while discussing her children's deaths. They presented testimony from doctors, nurses, detectives, and finally from Christy. The courtroom was silent as Christy spoke. Diane took the stand in her own defense. She smiled at the jury. She cried on cue. She told her story again, confident that her charm would carry her through as it always had. But something was different this time. The jury wasn't watching her words. They were watching her face. They saw the lack of grief. The performative emotion. The moments when she forgot to look sad. the flashes of irritation when questions didn't go her way. The same smile detectives had noticed on night one. After deliberating for less than a day, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Diane Downs was sentenced to life in prison. As she was led away, she turned toward the courtroom and smiled one last time. Not because she felt innocent, but because even then she believed she had been unforgettable. And in a way she was. Before we finish this story, make sure you're subscribed, leave a like, and comment the exact moment you think the truth became impossible to hide, because in this chapter the mask finally comes off. Prison did not change Diane Downs. From the moment she entered the Oregon Correctional Center for Women, guards noticed it. In a place where fear, regret, and survival usually strip people down to their core, Diane remained exactly as she had been in the interview room years earlier, smiling, chatty, convinced she was special. Other inmates described her as upbeat, flirtatious, and oddly proud of her notoriety. She introduced herself as a victim of injustice, someone misunderstood by a system that got it wrong. She spoke about her case constantly, not with sadness, but with excitement, as if retelling a favorite story. She believed her conviction was temporary. She believed she would be released. That belief never left her. In 1986, just 3 years into her life sentence, Diane proved once again how dangerous that confidence could be. She began a relationship with a married man who worked at the prison. Through charm, manipulation, and patience, she convinced him to help her escape. The plan worked. Diane walked out of prison and vanished. For 10 days, the woman who had once smiled her way through interviews was the subject of a massive manhunt. Media coverage exploded. The same face that had once appeared on television as a grieving mother now stared back from wanted posters. When she was finally captured, hiding, unarmed and unharmed, she didn't resist. She smiled. Back in custody, her escape only confirmed what many had long believed. Diane Downs did not feel guilt the way other people did. Consequences were inconveniences. People were tools. And attention, even negative attention, was fuel. Years passed. Outside prison walls, the children she had tried to erase grew up carrying scars that would never fully heal. Christy Downs, the daughter who testified against her own mother, lived with the weight of survival and the burden of memory. She had told the truth when it mattered most, but truth did not bring peace. It brought a lifetime of complicated emotions, anger, grief, and a constant question that never had an answer. What? Psychologists studied Diane's behavior for decades. Some labeled her a sociopath. Others pointed to narcissistic personality disorder. But labels never captured the full picture. What unsettled experts most wasn't just what she did, but how she reacted afterward. Diane never expressed genuine remorse. In interviews from prison, she continued to claim innocence. She spoke about herself as a misunderstood woman punished for being different. She criticized her children. She complained about the justice system. She blamed everyone except the person who pulled the trigger: herself. Parole hearings came and went. Each time, Diane presented herself as reformed, reflective, changed. And each time the board denied her release. They cited the same reasons again and again: lack of accountability, absence of remorse, and continued danger to the public. What stood out most during these hearings wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Even decades later, witnesses described the same chilling detail detectives noticed on the very first night. The smile. The inappropriate lightness. The inability, or refusal, to mirror the gravity of her actions. That smile became her signature. It was the smile of someone who believed she could outsmart any room she walked into. The smile of someone convinced that reality itself could be negotiated. The smile that, in the end, betrayed her more than any piece of evidence ever could. Today, Diane Downs remains in prison, serving a life sentence plus additional years. The world has moved on. New crimes have captured public attention. New faces have filled the news. But this case endures. Because it forces an uncomfortable truth into the light. Sometimes evil doesn't look monstrous. Sometimes it looks calm, friendly, convincing. Sometimes it looks like a person who smiles when everyone else would be broken. Detectives who worked the case still talk about that first interview. They say the evidence mattered, the testimony mattered, the forensics mattered, but the moment they truly knew came before all of that. It came when a mother spoke about her wounded children, and smiled. That smile was not a mistake. It was not shock. It was not denial. It was a glimpse of who she really was. And from that moment on, the ending was inevitable. Because lies can be rehearsed. Stories can be adjusted. But the truth has a way of surfacing in the smallest, quietest details. Sometimes it shows up as a pause. Sometimes as a contradiction. And sometimes, It shows up as a smile. At the exact moment everything is already over.